are obviously designed in a way that it's not something you have to particularly do for a Cert 4 qualification, and your business units could be credit transferred into another qualification. So if you're doing frontline management, potentially you could move those business units into that other qualification. So I guess the way that the criteria has been written, it's not civil construction specific or civil works or in any way construction specific for the business units. And that's predominantly our role as the facilitators, is to try and convert that and work with you guys to understand that unit. So a lot of it's left field, but in that it's basically getting you guys to also think outside the box, knowing that it is a business unit, and we're looking at it from the business operations perspective. And that's my role to guide you through that. With a personal work plan, it's predominantly looking at a work schedule or works program and identifying what your requirements are for that works program. In doing that, what we'll also be looking at creating is a Gantt chart. No doubt you guys are already probably reviewing and using Gantt charts or Microsoft Project, where it actually got timelines and you're actually reviewing that as part of your planning. Is anyone currently creating that input for those work schedules?
Yes.
Yep.
So we have to consider a lot.
Yep. Cool. So, and what we try and do in this training session is probably strip it back a little bit and take away some of the civil components and just go to the bare basics for developing works programs. So, as you progress through the training session, you'll definitely see that as we work towards that goal. So, if you've already involved in it, you'll find, you'll definitely find this session quite familiar and comfortable. For the guys that if you haven't done a lot of it, the way we've designed it is to take you through those steps to become familiar with all aspects of that. By no means are we doing a Microsoft project for a 2 or 3 year program. What we've looked at is we've looked at a project that we can do potentially over 20 to 30 days, something quite small, that in this training session for today we can actually plan it, design the schedule and actually complete it within the training day. Obviously if we have something too complex, it does give us time limits on us getting through all the content. So we've got a small project, a real project that we can look at with plans and specifications. So we've actually got something tangible, something that's actually real for you guys to look at as we go through the process. So as I go through that, I'll issue out bits and pieces. As I said, we're going down to basics, so we're stripping back using some of the electronic devices to do that software. So we won't be using Microsoft Project, unfortunately. That itself is teaching how to use the software, but I'm just going to teach you guys the process for creating a critical path and a cascading bar chart and go through that with you guys. And then we'll predominantly go out and we're going to input that data into a way that we can communicate it, and then we'll complete a work plan. So your work plan realistically is almost you guys identifying what your responsibilities would be for that project. And no doubt you're probably already doing it now. You're probably going, look, I already planned 2 to 3 weeks ahead, and I basically have my schedule and I put in key things in Outlook or in a diary or whatever you use to manage that. You're probably already doing that as part of your role. Obviously what we want you guys to do is demonstrate that you can do all that and put it all into one work plan. And the work plan has been designed in a particular way. It covers off against the unit of competency. So the idea with the work plan, it's you identifying, if this is my Gantt chart, this is what my responsibilities would be. This is some of the barriers that I might have to contend with within that project. This is how I might resolve those barriers. And it's identifying potentially your responsibility for the next 4 weeks. What are some of the key factors that you might have to do for that project for the next 4 weeks? So it's obviously, again, you're probably already doing that. You've got a work schedule or a program already, and you're basically working that out. The best way for you guys to really understand that process is also to create the actual schedule, the Gantt chart. So you're really embedded in that content. So you know that project in and out because you guys have actually constructed and built that. So that's why, as a team, I'll be getting you guys to work together to create the schedule, and then individually, just complete your own work plan on how you would manage that program. And that predominantly rounds up that unit as far as develop personal work priorities. So as far as it's showing that you can look at a work schedule or plan, pull the information out and plan your own activities. And it's a bit of an unusual unit that it also looks at your own performance and performance, I guess, monitoring your own performance against your activities. So, traditionally, when we look at performance review on projects, it's something that you might do after a project. You might do it at the end of a project where you sit down with your project manager or your supervisor and you do a review on your performance. It might be something that you just do annually in an annual performance review. So one thing that the unit also wants to draw out from you guys is understanding that how do you get feedback on your performance? Because yes, we can create a Gantt chart, we can create a personal work plan, but how do we know that we're actually successful in actually completing that to our required goals that we've identified? So that's something that the unit does talk about, and we'll obviously cover off on that content as well. So the unit describes the skills and knowledge required to plan and prioritise own work tasks. As I said, you're being with the roles that you're currently in, you're probably doing this all the time out there. It also addresses the skills and knowledge to monitor and obtain feedback on personal work performance. The unit applies to individuals who are required to design their own work schedules and work plans and establish priorities for their work. So the key elements is plan personal work schedule, implement personal work schedule, and review personal work priorities. All right. Developing plans to assist work groups with their work. Obviously, it's essential that teams create plans so that each member of the team is working towards a goal and members understand what is required, what deadlines must be met, and the resources which they need to work to, and what they've actually got available. A structured plan helps synchronise work team output with the organisational goals. No idea, a lot of the time you're predominantly being given resources and given, I guess, materials, but at the same time, if you are doing a lot of the pre-planning, I guess what we're looking at in this scenario is, again, a bit of a perfect world scenario, is in the fact that we can also strip away some of what you've got available, but you can also plan what resources you identify for the project. Like with any plan, you can always plan for that, get it reviewed, monitor that plan. So when we're doing the scenario, if you identify key things that you require for that, obviously it's a plan. We're not technically going to implement this particular plan, obviously, but it's just showing that you understand the process of planning for a project works. They also ensure that work objectives and goals are clear to all those who participate in achieving them. There are no goals, objectives, or plans. Employees will have nothing to aim for, no structure to their tasks. Their work will be chaotic, undirected. Undirected work does not achieve outcomes. Goals need to be SMART. Have we heard of that acronym SMART goals before? Has anyone heard that? A bit of a head shakes. Yes, no? So I guess when we're talking about SMART goals, predominantly you've probably already got your own I guess outputs or efficiency outputs that you look at in a workplace. You might have cubic meters moved, or so many linear meters of pipe load, or whatever it might be. So you might have already some sort of KPIs or objectives that's been identified within a workplace, and they get applied. And that's very similar in the fact that anytime you set an objective or some goals, is that we want to ensure that they are SMART. And SMART, the acronym, is just making sure that the goal itself is specific. So we want to make sure that if it's specific to the actual job role and job functions of that project. We want to make sure it's measurable. So I guess with the measurable, with an objective, what we're saying by that is we need to know that we've been successful in that. How do you monitor if you don't have that outcome from that? So something that can be measured will have a yes/no answer. Will often have a number, or it might have a true or false. So it might be that as far as the goal is remove a stockpile of material. At the end of the day, was the stockpile removed, true or false? Yes or no? So we can actually have that. We can have that. It might be that stockpile we want half the stockpile removed by the end of the day. So we've got a way of identifying that it can be measured. So we do need to have a goal or an objective needs to be measurable. So we can obviously monitor and review that. Achievable. It can't be something too extreme, because often that you probably know that if you've got someone performing an objective where it can't be achieved, a lot of time it's what's the point? There's no way we're going to finish that in time. It's unrealistic. So you get two factors there. You get people that don't try and achieve it, or they achieve it. They try to achieve it, never get close, and then obviously next time that goal is there again, the different disheartened motivation's not there, because you can never achieve your goals. There's no satisfaction from being able to never achieve your goals. Realistic at the same time, it's got to be, again, it can't be something completely left field that's got nothing to do with the actual project itself. As far as it's got to be realistic to the actual key objectives of that project. And the last one is timeline or time bound as well. So anytime you give we've got an objective, we want to make sure it's time bound, because if I tell you guys to go for a break and I don't actually give you a time, what is that? There is no conclusion. There's no end to that. So we need to be time bound. Go and have a break, 15 minutes. I've actually got I can control that and actually review and monitor that process. So again, just a quick revision, but when we're looking at our goals, we want to make sure that they can be measured, they are specific, they're achievable, and they're realistic to those tasks. How do we know that you're achieving what you need to achieve out there in the workplace? Self-assessment in relation to your own role and responsibilities on site. So completing a self-assessment is a good way of identifying any areas that require attention in terms of skill gaps or opportunities for further training and development. A lot of time, it's not something you would do a lot of. I guess when you sit down annually, who does annual performance reviews? 6 monthly, supposedly. We're the same. They always get bloody pushed back. When you do those, do you have sometimes like a KPI where it gets you to mark how you think you've gone?
Yeah.
It does?
Yeah.
Yep.
So we've got our own form, and then it asks a few questions, and then it's got you can ask yourself questions as well.
Yep.
So whoever's conducting it will ask a certain amount, and then the rest is like you feeling how you think you went.
Yeah, definitely, and you see that it's a standard practice with most HR documentations, particularly with the performance reviews. It's about getting that actual and perceived performance, because by doing a self-assessment, sometimes it's the only way where you actually pull out, is that my actual job role, is that my KPIs? Like, you don't often get that information thrusted upon you, or you review that a lot. So when you sit down annually or 6 monthly, you might have that. First thing you might look at is go, wow, my job role's changed a lot, and my KPIs don't really match anymore. That's a great thing to identify that you have progressed or changed your role, because at the same time you can look at addressing that as well, in the fact that your job role has changed, and you're potentially being, I guess, assessed against criteria that may no longer be relevant. Or there might be things on there that you've done really well that haven't been recognised. But by you doing that self-assessment, you might underrate yourself in a lot of areas, and then your supervisor will obviously review that and go, no, you've done really exceptional in those areas. It might be the opposite. You might go, well, I've exceeded in all these areas, and your supervisor might come back and say, actually, no, I don't believe you did. So it's a good way of identifying actual and perceived feedback. So it's a crucial part of the continuous improvement process within an organisation. It shows good self-awareness and can help managers gain an understanding of your own career objectives, get a clear picture of how the individual believes they are performing. Self-assessment can identify any gaps in communication or job clarity. as I identified, your job roles change a lot and you are responsible for a lot. And you might find that you all of a sudden, you've diverted your attention to a key area, all of a sudden you're involved more in the safety component or an area within the business, or it might be finances, it might be something, but all of a sudden when you go back to your traditional duty statement or KPIs, you've really moved away from that. So it can really help communicate your job clarity and go, well actually, my job role's changed and there is a need for this. Or it might be actually, I need to pull back and actually focus more on this. Because that's what you're asking me to do. So there can often be a gap between an individual believe they are performing at work and how their managers think they are performing. If there is a big discrepancy between self-assessment and the managers' assessment, it suggests a lack of feedback or not enough clarity on roles and responsibilities. So realistically, what they're saying is that if we do get some major discrepancies in perceived and actual, there probably hasn't been enough feedback throughout the course of that duration to actually to bring that closer together. Because if you're saying your quality of work, you believe it's excellent, and your supervisor's saying it's poor, it's terrible, you would think, well, why didn't you say something along the journey? Because how do I fix that? And that's the intent. You shouldn't really see it that extreme. Because if there is, then really what we're saying is the supervisor, project manager or your supervisor hasn't supported you or the communication hasn't really been there to obviously to provide that feedback. So getting feedback. I guess feedback definitely as far as doing your own review on your own performance is great, but definitely methods from within the workplace. Most commonly, it's probably from informal or even, as I said, formal discussions. So informal can be at the time, it's direct, you're doing it all the time. It might be on a quality of work or a performance where you're just discussing that with your peers or with your supervisor. Formal discussions, like we discussed before, it might be where you sit down annually and actually go through some criteria and work through that in a formal setting. So formal is more organised, documented communication, most typically seen as annual reviews, recognition programs, or in some cases disciplinary processes as well, where no doubt you're probably involved in that with your own workers and teams, where if they're not performing, you might have to go through disciplinary actions and record their behaviour, their performance, in a way that you are formally providing that feedback based on your company policies and procedures for that. Customer surveys and feedback forms. A lot of companies are doing this now after projects. They're actually going back to their stakeholders, their clients, and they're getting feedback. They're saying, how have we performed? Could we do anything better? And they're really showing that investment back with that stakeholder to say, we're listening to your feedback and obviously trying to always that continuous improvement process. No doubt you guys have been or seen and been involved in that already. But definitely customer feedback survey that you gather information about a specific goal. It could be something targeted. And it can also be something like a net promoter score survey or in a fact that it might just be a targeted question. And when we say about the net promoter score survey, businesses can send out this question and they can say on a scale of 10. Very simple, like in regards to our customer service, on a scale of 0 to 10, rate that. And then obviously next project or next activity, we can do the same question again and we can see if there's been an improvement from that. So very simple way, but very targeted. You often see that scale used a lot in feedback because it obviously it gives an opportunity to show improvement, but also potentially go the opposite way as well. So customer surveys and feedback forms is something we do a lot in our training environment, but definitely coming more involved out there with civil works. Interviewing colleagues. When often do you go out and interview a colleague? What might you need to interview a colleague or a peer or someone in the workplace? As supervisors, when might you need to do that? Usually for me, I see it a lot here, and it's part of my role here, when I have a behavioural issue. It's something that when something goes, a performance issue within a workplace, you often might go and actually have a chat with other workers within that environment and actually get their feedback. And you know, if someone's, as part of my role, I deal with some of the, as a responsible officer, any of the behaviour issues that occur within the organisation, I'll go on and assist in that. But it might be that you actually go and have to get targeted feedback from people within that workspace to actually gather an idea of that person's behaviour or performance. And that's where you might use that interviewing technique. But potentially what it does enable you guys to do with interviewing colleagues is get targeted feedback on specifics. It might be about quality of activity, it might be about punctuality, it might be about you know, being prepared, applying policies, procedures about PPE. So if there's been sort of behavioural issues along that areas, it's a way of actually checking in or supporting that feedback. So definitely another way of getting information. Obviously, once we've got that, methods to analyse feedback. So obviously, once we get all this information, we can then obviously analyse that and look at that feedback. And methods that can include categorisation by type of feedback. So we can categorise the feedback itself into different areas. It might be quality, it might be safety, it might be efficiency, it might be behaviour. And again, Manny, you were saying with your performance review, you might have key areas that you review yourself on. And that's part of that area, that they're categorised in key areas. And they all might be on a scale. So you've got it all categorised. So you can then use that categorisation as a benchmark, and you can look at probably 20 people within your organisation and look at that one category and say, well, out of all my 20 employees, where did roughly everyone score? And if they all scored at up around the 9s as far as their ratings, and then you've got some that were down 3s and 2s, you can obviously identify that there's a big change or a variance in those particular individuals. So it's definitely one way of getting that feedback and sorting through that. Root cause analysis, so what we're saying about there, about analysing it, that's again, it's referring back to when there's a problem. So root cause analysis is simply about getting to the root cause of the problem, complaint or dispute, to help identify potential sources of complaints, so that as a business you can tackle the root causes of problems and correct or prevent those problems from occurring. So really, it's again where we're going to really source more information about that particular root cause. So again, if it's one specific behaviour issue, we're trying to establish why that potentially may have occurred. Is it a process issue? Is it a supervision issue? Is it a lack of training? In regards to, is it that person's behaviour? So what are we trying to find the root cause of that potential issue with that problem that may have occurred? We can also use a range of graphical information or charts to help visualise and see that as comparisons. So using charts and graphs to identify trends. So we can obviously plot that. If you, as I said, if you had all your staff, you could use that data and you can use comparisons. Comparisons of feedback in similar areas. So that's that benchmarking as well. So you might have three work teams. Their performance levels might be X, Y. And you can rate all three teams against each other and benchmark and see sort of where they're faring. So again, using charts and graphs is just another way of visualising and to analyse that information. So we get all the data, we put it into a chart, and we can visualise and see that. So once we've obviously analysed it, what do we do with it? So methods may include identifying specific areas of improvement. So once we've obviously got that in a way that we can review that, we're definitely going to use that to go, well, if someone's performing a lot lower in comparison to other people, how do we lift them or support them to make improvements? Responding to feedback and trends. So obviously if we're finding that all of a sudden our quality of work has dropped, we can obviously respond to that. Assess the impact of feedback or achievement of work group objectives. So if we're going to provide feedback about performance, is that going to have a positive impact. A big thing with anything within the workplace is that workplace culture, but it's just making sure that once we obviously pass on that feedback, is monitoring how that is affected. So if you give feedback on someone's work performance, does it mean it's going to actually improve? And then use other data support or discount stakeholder feedback. So you might find that if you get feedback from one source, one area, you might look at other areas of feedback. Say if you interviewed one of your staff members' colleagues and they provided really bad negative feedback, what potentially could be the risk with that by going to one person and they're providing really bad negative feedback?
Yeah, but expanded. You need more than just one. Because that one person might not love that one person and say bad things.
Yeah, so you're just trying to ensure that is the feedback justified? Like exactly that, and that's something identified. They call it a 360-degree feedback. Has anyone heard of that before? It's just, instead of just going to one source of information, it's taking a bigger picture and exactly that 360. It's a method of an employee review that provides each employee the opportunity to receive performance feedback from their supervisor or manager, and potentially 4 to 8 peers or reporting staff members. So all we're saying, it's a greater pool of staff, and in some cases it might even be the customer as well. So again, what you might find is that you've got internal and external customers. You might find that an employee within the, within the internal, the admin environment, has bad communication, negative feedback with that team. But out there on the field with the work team, they're amazing. They get things happening. So you've got two areas, and if you've got the feedback from the internal, that'd be really negative. But on the flip side, they're really positive feedback out in the team. So it's just trying to get that 360 all rounded and trying to identify not only necessarily the areas for improvement, but you might also find areas that haven't been identified before. So you might uncover procedural issues that haven't been identified, but you also might identify key strengths that haven't been looked at. You might find the flip side. The internal side says their paperwork and reporting process is perfect. So don't have to send back any reports back. It's all completed immaculately, and they really excel in that. Where you might have some supervisors with their paperwork and reporting, sometimes don't necessarily get in on time and struggle with that, and you might find that there's someone there that can really support the other team members to actually improve on those key areas. So again, it's just another area about getting greater feedback. So in that, obviously, as I said, annually or in your own internal process of review, the main thing obviously with any feedback is that it's done in many forms, but it's also done done for the right reason, and you're going to find that you're going to be in the forefront of providing that feedback, especially when you are monitoring and overseeing activities. So I guess one of the things that we're going to sort of move into is actually creating a work plan, and part of that is obtaining information about resources, client needs, work group targets that can help you prepare your work plans. So you could review your organisation's strategic and operational plans. I think one of you yesterday was probably looked at that, which is probably more of an overview, simplified just initial plan on your long-term strategic goals. You could analyse budgets and forecasts. You could review KPIs, and you might also have historical data. I think with most of the time when we look at forecasting and preparing a work schedule, most organisations look at that historical data. We've done this previously, we've done this similar roles, and we're using that information to forecast when we do more future activities. So, very simple, if you've got a activity, if you can say that, to box out and do X, whatever it might be, it will take X amount of time. And that's probably the crucial part for you guys, is that being subject matter experts, the hardest thing to determine realistically is the time frame of an activity, and probably its dependency. And what I mean by dependency is that if I was to say that we're creating a concrete slab on the ground, and you start thinking about the steps involved to do that, and it might be initial set out, it might be excavation works, it might be form work, it might be the Forticon plastic, the reinforcement, and you go through all the steps that you need to do to get to that finished product. So in a logical sequence, most of the time you guys in your job role is that you've done that many a times, the activities that's required. So naturally in your head you're putting that sequence in place. But all of a sudden we talk about a dependency is something that prevents the next activity from occurring. So obviously if I was going to pour the mud in there, if I didn't have the formwork, I can't pour the mud. So the pouring the concrete itself is dependent on the formwork being there. As we get more elaborate with projects and activities, you might find that one task is dependent on a whole range of activities before it can be completed. So that part in itself does need yourselves to really identify what those dependency lines are, to help forward plan for that project. Business technology can be extremely useful when it comes to planning. There are software application programs already discussed this morning about Microsoft Project. By knowing what's dependent and the time frame, punch that data in and it spits out beautiful looking Gantt charts. It also can flip that into a calendar and give you a daily activities of all that information. Amazing. You can also do network diagrams in there as well. So just by having that key data, the software does enable you to do that. Obviously getting access to that, I think we've moved away from Palm Pilots these days. I think it's smartphones and iPads, or tablets I should say. Shouldn't be biased to a particular brand. We've got iPads. But again, having that information on site it does have its benefits. However, it's obviously important that technology is not a means to an end, and a lot of time you can also spend a lot of time actually learning the software and the programming itself. You could spend a lot of time sorting and sifting and working through those programs, which can also detract you from your main role of your work objectives. So if it's output and it's activity, obviously having that software where you've got to again can detract you from that. So if you're focusing on perfecting the features of your personal organiser, obviously it can impact on that as well. So with obviously using business technology, many things that we already use a lot of, payroll applications, no doubt, I don't know if anyone does manual timesheets anymore, or time, it's all, again, scheduling apps, programs, again, we use that now a lot. Microsoft Teams and Zoom, definitely something that we can thank COVID for. We've really been thrusted into that space, and I think it's definitely it's there to stay now in regards to the accessibility of just whacking a computer on and doing a Teams meeting instead of having to jump in a car and travel in for a meeting. Budget and financial programs, organisational internal intranet and company quality assurance systems. No doubt you guys with your systems, you've probably got them internally controlled. Even now as well, I think GPS plant and tools, rovers, site survey equipment have become the norm. We still train and teach automatic levels, dumpy levels, but as far as our training goes, but we know that the industry has pretty much even moved away from, there's even total stations now that can be utilised, which are so simple that you don't need to be a surveyor to function and use that system. So they're becoming more and more accessible for you guys to utilise. So again, there's a whole range of functions that technology is available for you guys to use. With that though, is it always efficient and effective to use business technology to manage and monitor planning and scheduling activities? No? Yes? What's your take on that?
Definitely ridiculous. Guys went down payroll every week, so now with proper payroll apps, it's a lot better.
Yep.
What time's captured each day and each job type of thing. So kind of
Yeah, definitely that data can be used a lot easier too. You can really want it with a payroll application, and on time spent on a project, you can reuse that. Whereas that manual effort of putting it into spreadsheets and then actually trying to pull that out. So I guess it's got so many more applications there with that data. It's there. Accessibility. You walk out there with an iPad now, and your company policies and documentation. You've got it all on hand. Not necessarily the easiest way to always review it, but it's there. You can often zoom in, but you've got access to it. I guess one negative with that too is that often it's not easily accessible. One, yourself as a supervisor, you might have an iPad or someone might have it, and then it's not like you can share it to your whole work team. Oh, here, have mine, and I'll you work through it. So it's often a bit not as accessible to everybody, but it does give you those opportunities. So again, what processes can be used to assist with develop civil construction work priorities? So again, I'm going to strip it back with the planning process. We're going to talk about civil. Key information that can be found in a work plan includes resource requirements. So basically what we're trying to understand is, if you've got a project, what resources do you need? And I always break the resources down into human resources. The most important part of any project is your human resources, and that's predominantly capability. Who do I need? What? And sometimes you might categorise them as capability, as in I need a plumber, I need an electrician, I need a plant operator. As far as skill sets go, as far as those resource requirements. Equipment can be like your mobile plant. It could be small, could be any range of equipment that you use, leg rammers, plate compactors. So it can be a variance in equipment, and obviously materials. So human, as I said, are the most probably crucial part, probably the hardest ones to manage, in the fact that if equipment breaks down, has a bad day, we often just grab another one and replace it very quickly, and it predominantly does the same thing. If we replace like for like, it will do the same thing. You can't necessarily replace a human skill set or a resource like for like. It's again, so it's a lot harder to manage that. Materials, same sort of scenario. All of a sudden we have an issue with supplier. We can often go to another supplier and get more resources. Often there might be a variance in that, but again, it's something you obviously will you'll work with. So definitely resource requirements are crucial. Stakeholder client needs, work group targets. So again, if I've got a specification and a set of drawings or plans, predominantly the stakeholder client needs, they might identify what they particularly want for that project. So normally that will come through a range of their specifications, or their drawings, their plans on what they require. Work group targets, obviously in a work plan we want to identify, what are we trying to achieve for that? So what is the actual objective? And often or not, with a team, you probably do it already, as I said. You've got like your own KPIs, where it might be cubic meters or linear meters. You actually have an expected output that you achieve for the day. And that way you can obviously measure that and say, if we're doing pipe laying, it might be X amount of pipes, so that we can actually get something that's tangible. We can measure that and say that we've actually achieved what we've set out to achieve for that work group target. So obviously by having that information, it just helps you guys as a supervisor then obviously not only plan for that and look for any barriers or issues, but you can also obviously make sure that you're managing and overseeing those works. So with resource requirements, as I said, it could be plant requirements, as quantities, specific plant required, and specialised equipment. So often or not too, as I said, within your own workplace, this is your fleet, and that's what you've got to use. So often or not, that is the scenario that you've got to work with that equipment. In our planning, I would like you guys to think of like perfect world scenario. If you want a specialised piece of equipment that would make the job shorter or simpler, obviously, put that into your project plan. It's a plan in that regard. Labour, staff requirements for a project could include labourers, engineers, subcontractors. Definitely I would like to see in your projects, in your plans, that yourself as supervisors are going to be used throughout the program. But there might be skill sets that every time we do this activity, some companies say that we have our work team that are multi-skilled and they do concreting, they do a range of all the activities, and they might just have a crew of 4 or 5 that do everything. And you get some organisations come in and say, well, no, we'll get in a concreter or a form worker, which is fine. It doesn't really matter how we work through that. It's just identifying how you would manage and plan for that project works. Materials, bill of quantities for the project, specific materials needed, any lead times and specified items. So with this particular project, I'm not going to get you guys to write a full bill of materials using specifications, but what I would like you guys to do is identify key materials in the fact of a delivery for your schedule. So if we're talking about that we've got concrete or pipes that are going to be laid, or we've got key resources, I would like to know in your schedule when those resources arrive. Now, as far as that goes, when we look at any project, is it beneficial to have all your resources rock up on day one, or is it better to stagger it throughout the project? And I get you get mixed messages, and that depends on the size of the project.
Yeah.
Depends on what the project is. Staggering, obviously, again, where do we store it all? Theft. There's all these factors that come into it. With the resources acquisition at the moment, getting stuff on site, sometimes it's better just to order it all and have it all rock up and know we can continue. Sometimes you can't get it, so you've got to just plan and as it comes in, you work through it. So there's a whole range of things you consider, but in your plan, what we'd also, I want you guys to consider that is, if you're planning for this job, when would you want the resources? One thing I would like to, I'm looking for realistically though, is when we're planning it, if you've got your concrete pour happening on day 5, and on your key resource delivery, you've got your concrete coming on day 6, obviously I'd see a discrepancy in your plan. So it's all you're really showing me is you understand the process of planning that, if we're going to do site setup, you would expect to see your fencing and resources arrive on the day or the day before, not 2 or 3 days later. So it's just you guys showing me you understand when you would want those resources. Financial budgets or expectations are an important aspect of the job plan and are closely connected to all resource requirements. So again, if you go into an operational plan where you're overseeing budgets, that might be a key aspect to that part of your plan as well. Understanding what some of those financial expectations are as well. Most of the time, we're predominantly looking at time in regards to time spent on the job, and that potentially probably then equates to monetary value anyway, as far as the works program itself. Obviously, the more days that we spend on the project, it's going to cost the organisation more. The less time that we spend on there, we can obviously start and progress to newer projects. One thing that we're going to look at, part of our Gantt charts, is when we look at our resources, is we're going to identify if we're resource dependent. Because on some projects, what you can do is you can run with a small group, but by having some of your tasks running not all concurrently at the same time, and by spreading them out throughout the project, you could still use the same amount of resources to complete that project. Or I could bring all those activities and we could start on day 1 with 50 people, and we could work through all those activities on day 1. But it's a lot of human resources to do that. If I was to spread those activities out, I could potentially use less people, but still complete it within the same time frame. So sometimes we talk about being resource dependent and also leveling off, where we try and move activities that don't need to be completed on day 1 and move them to a day where we've got minimal activity happening, So we keep the work crew busy throughout the program, but we actually start moving things around. So we'll be looking at that process as well. Stakeholder client needs. So as I said, we've got client expectations for the deadline of the project. Often or not, generally we've committed to a deadline. That's something we're going to look at as well, because when we look at a Gantt chart, when we look at a critical path, often or not we look at a time frame. We could literally add up all the individual tasks times and project a worst case scenario. But we know that often or not you're doing concurrent activities, and we can look at a best case scenario finishing time. So we can look at the project deadlines. Quality assurance, often or not ITPs, so inspection test plans. So with the quality assurance, often when you look at a specification, you might actually find that there's certain control points or witness points that need to be put in place that all of a sudden now prevent you from your normal your normal dependency line of all of a sudden they've thrown something in where it needs to be inspected by the client, which normally you would just progress with your works. All of a sudden you might need to create an ITP from your specification to identify those key areas to ensure that your works can happen in that progression. No doubt you're probably already familiar with that. One thing they always talk about here is compaction testing and soil compaction, like where obviously if we do any works, we can't then start building on top of that until the results come in to say that we've achieved those our pass marks to us to continue with construction. Job specifications and plans in detail discussed prior to commencing projects. We haven't purposely done it, but there are discrepancies in here. No doubt Rowan probably already might remember some of these, but basically the plan and the spec don't always align. How often or not do you find that, where you find discrepancies within that? So the idea is obviously when we do a review of this is that part of your client stakeholder needs is to try and address them early so it doesn't become embedded in the plan. All of a sudden we get to that point and go, shit, we've got conflicting information. Which then obviously can cause issues with progression. You might have gone and done something that's more expensive and all they wanted was something that was less expensive, but it just wasn't clearly communicated within the documentation. All right, our work group targets. So project specific targets relating to various topics such as production, deadlines, we talked a bit about this. Normally with a Gantt chart, you've generally got what's expected. I want up to day 5, I want the mud poured. You know, you've got those key targets, and generally they can be visualised on that chart. Individual roles and responsibilities. So one thing that we want you to do for your personal work plan is consider what your personal responsibilities would be for that plan. So if you're acting as the supervisor, what might you have to do to ensure that the following week, if you do have the concrete planned in your schedule, what might you need to do as part of that? So what I would probably see in your work plan is that you would need to order your concrete probably 2 days prior, or I'd like to see that, you know, you're thinking about what's happening next. So in your personal work plan, what we're going to be getting you guys to do is put in potential notes of how you would plan for that project. So the week before, we'd like to see notes of what's happening the following week to ensure that you are planning for those activities. Cost and budget targets. Again, we're not looking particularly in finance in this particular plan, but there may be cost and budget targets that need to be identified, and they also may be in your actual work plan as well. And definitely potentially a key feature of the plan, identifying potential costs related to delays in projects such as liquidated damages. So again, we're predominantly more or less looking at timeline, key responsibilities, and we'll be looking at you guys identifying those key barriers and your personal responsibilities for planning for the works. So with the construction, it does define the work that to be completed. and in the order which will be accomplished. So normally with that, if we were to put it all onto a bar chart, basically we had task 1, task 2, task 3. If we were just to plot that takes 3 days, that takes 4 days, that takes a day. It's in no real sequence. So what we're saying is if I did Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, you know, it's sort of showing that everything's starting. We've got 3 activities starting on Monday. But often what you'll find with your when I call it reference a cascading bar chart, where the cascading bar chart comes into play is that when task 2 is dependent on task 1 being completed, is then that's when we would start task 2. Task 3 is dependent on task 2 being completed, and then we would complete that. And obviously then we can start seeing progression on days, on how in regards to the completion of that task. Obviously in that it's going to list the task in sequence, and that's something I'm going to get you guys to do in the team, is look at that and just go, what are the potential tasks involved in doing that project? So in developing the plan, first thing we do is we determine the general approach to the project. Often or not, is it something that you would do internally? You know, we can think about how we would do that. Ask questions about the project. You know, if there's stuff missing, you know, we can go back to the client, stakeholder, your supervisor. In our case, I'll provide you supporting information in that environment. Breaking the project into activities. So if we're looking at constructing a concrete footpath, it'll be, you know, what are the activities involved in doing this? So a concrete footpath, you might go, that's just one activity to me. But what we're going to be doing to go through the process is just break this down further. And this technique then can be used in larger scale projects where you just basically take work chunks or work pieces and we could break them down. And eventually we could keep breaking them down into smaller chunks. And this technique can be used obviously for larger scale projects, because what you would do is you'll just continually do this process until you've broken down all those components. And eventually you would have a massive, but you would have a really big works program with all your activities and scheduling involved. Establish sequential relationships, so basically dependencies, what's dependent on what. Presenting the plan graphically as a network. So we want to be able to visualise and see that. So it's really easy to communicate with this type of graphs and information and network charts than it is to have that information just written down on a page of activities. It's very easy to identify and visualise that, hence why we see that a lot in our industry. And then endorsement of the plan by the project team. So the reason we've got this coming in is that the endorsement process is just obviously looking for those issues and opportunities for improvement. So every time I do this activity, I get a variance in timeframes, which is fine. But it's good, I keep recording that information, and as we come through in the groups, I represent that to the new groups for review as well. So it's always good to have an understanding of what other people are thinking about those project activities and timeframes. Like anything, once something then's endorsed, we're obviously then going to implement it, but then we're going to monitor that. Like any of these plans, no real plan realistically is set in concrete, pardon the pun. But the main thing about that is the review process and checking mechanisms. And often or not, that's why we have key milestones put into projects, where you might say midway point, or so many days in, or you might do monthly, or if it's a small project, you might do weekly check-ins. If it's that small, it might be daily, where you're just doing reviews and seeing where you're at with that program and tracking that progress. The most important thing with any works program, obviously, is that if you're already implementing or following one, is that having that understanding that I guess it's very hard to make those initial changes once it's already been implemented. If we can review it prior, we can potentially look for those improvements up front and make those necessary changes initially. No doubt already, we've probably seen it a lot the last few months in winter. If you're planning any works around June, July, if you didn't have any contingencies in there for rain days, you probably would have found that your project would have been pushed out, delayed dramatically, especially with what we've seen with the weather recently. So again, there are things that you can already identify or potentially put into play, and some organisations, depending on the length of duration of a project, will automatically add a percentage of days to allow for those contingencies to kick in. So if you're planning a project, if you don't allow a certain contingency, potentially more so time frame, you'll find that your programs are going to be very well affected by those barriers. So what is work breakdown structure? A work breakdown structure is a decomposition of work necessary to complete a project. So just basically just breaking it down, and it's arranged in a hierarchy and constructed to allow for a clear logical groupings, either by activities or deliverables. So it might be that we have a project. So in our case, our project is this. Then we look at the components. Then we could break the components down further. And we can also break it down to work packages. So we're using this as a simple term. We're starting with a project. We're breaking it down into small components. And we're actually breaking this itself down. Obviously, if we had a larger, as I said, major project, we can look at all those elements and we can keep using the same process to break them down. And we end up with a lot of work packages that eventually add up to our project. So the process I'm taking you through is the process, and it can be applied in many applications. At the same time, I'm going to strip away any of your subject matter knowledge, expertise, so you can't rely on, I guess, working out those dependencies. You have to use the process and information to work through that content. So we're going to truly go through the planning process. Once we've done the training in that element, then I'm going to allow you guys to transition into the actual project, where obviously the civil works, the civil planning comes into play, and we can work as a group, and you can actually then plan your work schedule in a group. Again, using those same similar techniques that you've learned in your training. Right, so almost there. So part of that breakdown, as I said, I want you guys to look at materials, personnel, units of plant, and potentially, I've got transport, but I just want to look at key deliverables, deliveries, items, clearly. So I don't want a full breakdown of resources. For the timing of the session, we can still achieve what we need to achieve in the session by identifying key resources that are delivered in your work schedule. Basically, how we could visualise that, we could either use a network diagram, or we can also use precedent diagrams. So a network diagram, task 1, 2, so a network diagram is just visually identifying, first of all, what the tasks, the number of tasks that we have. So as you can see, we've got 5 tasks, and it might be, again, it might be the setup, it might be pack up, clean up, whatever it might be. But we've got the 5 tasks, we've got the dependency lines. So quite clearly that sort of identifies there that if I want to complete task 3, task 1 and task 2 have to be completed prior. So they're dependent on that. I can't complete task 3 until those tasks are completed. If all of a sudden I get a resource issue with task 3, my supplier doesn't deliver on time, I've got, as soon as task 1's completed, I can jump down and do task 4. It's not dependent on anything else. So it gives me a contingency in tasks that I can go and jump and do that. At the same time, if I was looking at time frames, if I go, 1 day, 2 days, 1 day, 1 day, and 1 day, let's say all of a sudden I've got an issue with task 2, something's happening with there, this is 1 day, I could start this concurrently at the same time as task 2, but I could also, move this and do this concurrently at the same time as task 3. It's still going to be completed within the same time frame, as long as the individual tasks don't sort of exceed the allocated time frame. So all a network diagram is, it just visually sees what task we've got and what's dependent on what. The precedence diagram is the next level of information where we actually start putting in, I guess, as far as calculating, putting in dependency lines, timings, and actually calculating a critical path. So the precedence diagram lets us calculate the critical path, which identifies the key tasks that need to be done to ensure that we finish on time. So the scheduling process determines the timing of work activities, identifying by the planning process, and results in a project schedule. The essential steps in developing a schedule are estimating the time required for each activity. So sometimes it's hard. You've got to go, the site setup, it might take 2 or 3 hours. For our scenario, gentlemen, what I'd like you to look at is just full days. Okay, for us to go through this process, we're just going to look at full days. So again, it gives us the opportunity to get through the amount of content today. I don't necessarily want half days or 3/4 days, so we're just going to go and look at full day time frame. Computing the time required for project completion, establishing time intervals in which activity must start and finish, identifying the activities crucial to timely project completion. And no doubt, once we see that visually, it's really easy to see what the last day was, what each chunk of activity we should take, and when it should finish visually. The critical path method of scheduling makes use of a single or deterministic time estimate for each activity in the network. Such time estimates can be reasonably generated from prior experience. A lot of time with the critical path method, if I talk about that concrete slab on ground, naturally in your head, if you've done it previously or done that activity previously, you already put it in the critical path. You already go, no, you have to put the formwork in before you put the mud in. So that's why doing this process for you guys, you generally find it very a lot simpler in the fact that it's a recollection of tasks done previously. And you're predominantly already rearranging those activities in a critical path. The process that I'm going to show you guys manually is by not using civil works, is that you have to use the process to be able to calculate critical path. So critical path calculations are then performed to establish the early and late start times for each activity, setting the window for performance. Critical activities are those lying on the network path requiring the greatest time of completion. So basically what we're saying is that if I went this way first and went to task whatever this is, and did 1 day, 2 days, then finish 3 days, when I've got basically 4 days down here, it's impossible to complete that in planning. If I planned that I was going to take 4 days to do this, so my critical path is the longest duration. Because what we're saying is if I'm doing these activities in 4 days, hypothetically, if I've got the right team allocation, I should be able to complete these within that 4 days. So if I had a work team on this and a work team here, what we're saying is technically I could start by 3 days. I've got a day up my sleeve theoretically in that planning. So when we work out the critical path, we're basically working out the longest duration of the actual project. Now, I guess it's depending on how your work schedules are calculated. If it's been budgeted that your program is done on critical path, what we're saying is that this is again perfect world scenario on planning. That means within those 4 days, nothing goes wrong. So we're saying it's planned, it will take 4 days, but if anything goes wrong, obviously your critical path then is affected. Because if this takes 2 days, it's obviously going to extend our overall time frame. If this activity here, something goes wrong, and it takes 2 days, it's not going to affect our critical path. If that takes 3 days, then obviously it will. So it's just identifying those key areas that can affect our end outcome of our project. So identifying the critical path of the project helps to prepare personal plans and establish priorities. Identifying the critical path is a key to prioritising tasks for the project. It means that resources be assigned in the right area. We're focusing on the ones that are going to provide us with the most successful completion of that project. And make sure we can obviously hit those key milestones. And it prevents time being wasted on unimportant work activities. It's always good to have contingencies, but if we did all those activities first, then obviously we're detracting from completing our main objective. So by identifying the critical path, it helps accurately schedule subcontractors and determine dates that will be required. The critical path helps plan future works and where external contractors are required. So again, all we're saying is we just don't want to affect the critical path because that's going to make sure that the project is finished on time. It's key from a budget and financial perspective. If we're relating days or time, that's going to be financial impact. So as soon as we go over that, obviously there's going to be a cost there as well. So if you spend time on works that aren't crucial to the progress of the project, it can definitely affect future projects. If you're stuck on a project extra days and you can't jump to the next one, it's obviously going to affect that next project as well. So it does have those bigger financial impacts. And that's where we come to a contingency plans. What is a contingency plan?
Backup plan?
Backup plan, plan B, yep. What are some of your contingency plans that you've already got in place? What are some of the things that you already have? What things can go wrong?
For breakdown equipment, people, sick days, so pandemic, so that means bloody people going different directions.
Yep.
And
that's
sites, changing depots, all
Yep.
sorts of stuff.
And that's the key focus of that contingency. There's different key areas, and it goes back to some of your resources. So you've got obviously contingency for the human resource. I know everyone's felt this with COVID. Like all of a sudden, someone's gone for 5 days now. I think it's 5. Changes all the time. I'm not sure what it is at the moment, but it just really identifies that all of a sudden you've lost someone from your workforce for a whole period, which could be a key skill set. So that's something that you're really going to have to have planned for now. Where traditionally when someone's gone off sick, it's generally not that great a time frame. Equipment failure, resource, that's another one that we often we're aware of, and even materials. The material shortage and delays on that. Again, you've probably got standard contingencies where you just don't go to one supplier. You have you've got accounts with hire companies ready to go. So if something breaks down, it's a matter of your acquisition or your way of then gaining access to hire equipment. Obviously, that contingency has a cost to your project, and you can only run on that contingency for so long. So, and that's exactly what you've identified there. Contingency,
It's backup plans. Plan B, accessing labour hire, subcontractors for skill sets, have initial supplies available if you experience material shortages. So yeah, again, stuff that we already consider. Wet weather, you know, having other activities that we can jump to. If we, as I said, obviously we always want to get back to that critical path, but by being able to reallocate resources in other areas, we can keep the works progressing. So the importance of contingency plans. So I guess the most important thing really for a contingency is knowing what the trigger is. So you know, when do we actually pull the trigger on implementing that contingency plan? Most triggers are either a date or a condition, a brief description on how the organisation will operate while the contingency plan is in effect. So as you said, if the staff member doesn't rock up, you would have a process in potentially in acquiring potentially a new person, or you might just have to change your work for activity for that day to counteract that loss of that skill set. So information on variation of variables which will affect the contingency plan implementation. Obviously there's going to be financial implications and flow-on effects from that contingency plan. What we're trying to get you guys to identify in your work plan is what are potentially some of those barriers and contingencies that you may need to be thinking of, and you know, what could go wrong, and what are some of the, I guess, the responses of things that you could do within your currently the organisation does to counteract that. So if we think of them prior, if they do occur, we've already got that initial, as I said, that contingency to continue on with the work activity. So we want to see suggestions on how we can problem solve. The big thing that we often forget about as well is retraction of a contingency. How do we know that all of a sudden we've got, you know, again, staff members away, we bring someone else in, they're doing an amazing job, they're going really great, but we've obviously got a retraction. So when do we obviously change or stop that contingency from occurring? So we jump across into one activity because it's wet weather and we start doing that, the weather's clearing up. We could jump back across, but we're halfway through this. Well, do we finish this one off now? You know, it's all about understanding when do we retract, and you need to obviously you need to know that as as part of your planning process. Obviously, if we're bringing in extra resources, if we're hiring an equipment, that's extra cost. If we're bringing in extra resources, that's extra cost. If you're just swapping team members within your work team, it's probably less of an potential cost, but it's obviously you know, it's still a loss there initially. So again, the crucial part with any sort of contingency plan is just knowing how to retract that. So again, for instance, after manual review and remediation of the problem causing the shutdown, the operation which the shutdown can be recommenced. Most common, there's simple ways of retracting. As you said, staff members off sick, staff members back, away we go. Always consider extension of time requests. Often or not, potentially that's what happens a lot with our programs. We get so many delays and issues that we end up having to extend the project. A lot of time we can do a number of things as an organisation. I can all of a sudden just throw you guys more resources. So if you've got, say, a 4 or 5 person work crew, all of a sudden we go, all right, have another I guess another 8 people. Is that going to necessarily mean you're going to finish or catch up in time with 8 people?
Not really.
Not really? What are some of the issues that could go wrong?
Too many people working over each other, depending on what job you're doing. Like, yeah, there's no point one digger having 8 blokes spot him.
Yep. Again, so and that's it. The trying to catch up by putting more resources into play is not necessarily always going to fix that. You might not actually have the physical materials on site at the time. You might catch up that quickly, then now you're waiting on materials, so you can't actually progress forward. So there's a lot of aspects that can cause issues with that. As you said, too congested. Other activities are dependent on others, so it doesn't happen in time. So it can obviously work and it can't. So again, it's just identifying, is that a substantial contingency to bring in extra people? Because often or not, that's generally what happens. You're behind, we'll throw more people at it and try and get it through quicker, but it's not necessarily going to happen. Wet weather, we throw more people at it because you stopped. It's wet weather. We know that if we can't work, we can't work. We might have to look at other ways of working through that. And that's where we can look at other activities within that project to move to make up some time and then come back to that. So scheduling does provide critical information to owners, architect, engineers, contractors, subcontractors, suppliers and the public. Obviously, by having the scheduling, it is that plan. It gives us a communication piece. Obviously, we know when to order materials. We know what our expectations are as far as output goes. It's just a real easy way of visualising that information. There is a knowledge assessment for this unit. It's basically 5 questions, which most of the questions we cover off practically now. Like a lot of the content we revise and go through that in a practical sense. But I have also covered that key content in our presentation this morning. At the same time, you've got a workbook which will have that content in there for you. At the same time, online, when you do your online assessment, you will also have an electronic workbook which you can also use and search function and review content as well. So you do have that additional reference material if required. But what we'll do right now, I'll give you a break. I've bashed your ears for a bit. So 15-minute break. And then after that, we'll get straight into practical activities for the rest of the day. And then I said, yeah, this afternoon we'll jump in the computer room and make sure that
as I mentioned,
your
network analysis exercise 1, there's written information there. It was to draw the activity boxes and dependency as follows. As I identified, you've got the written text. You can't technically start from item 1 and work your way down. You've got to sift through all that information. And it's the same with anything. When you're sifting through specification job plans, sometimes you have to read through all that information to work out, oh, hang on, there's now a dependency or there's another item that's dependent on something else. And that's the idea, is that we're looking at key written text to work out those dependencies. So as we identified, by going through the information, we identified that A is the first activity. And then we've got to follow suit from that. So what I've identified there, we've got B and C follow A. I want to put B and C. So I've got B and C follow A. And what I'm doing is I'm drawing in dependency lines. That's I'm just working my way through. Then I've looked at information, and I've got D precedes I but follows B. So D's before I, but then follows B. So I'll put in the follows B must be here, but precedes I. So it's before I, so I comes in there. I was using that information. Okay. I've also got G and H follow C and finish before J. So G and H. G and H. And finish before J. We know that we've already identified that J is the last activity. If it says it finishes before J, it's telling me that they go to J. I've got E starts before B and finishes before F and G. So E starts before, E starts after B, correction. E starts after B and finishes before F and G. F and G.
I follows F and finishes before J. So what that shows me, if I follows F, I've got to move I. Because it's after F. Still keep that dependency. And finishes before J. So I should have everything linked now. So as you can see with the network diagram, I don't have any tasks that aren't linked. So it shows me that dependency line. And as you can sort of determine, if I was going to be doing task G, I can see the dependency lines. I know that E and B and A need to be completed, and I also know that C needs to be completed as well by linking that. So it's a very quick visual way of seeing what's dependent on what. And if these were task names, as I said, no doubt you could easily match that up quite quickly. You might have drawn it slightly different. You might have drawn letters in different spots, but it doesn't really matter. So we know the first activity is P, and pretty confident the last activity will be, you've all got S.
Yes.
So from that process, we've got M and L can both start in parallel after P. M and L. I've got M and L starting in parallel after P. Then I've got both B and E can be done concurrently, but only after the completion of M, B and E. B precedes O, so B's before O. A follows O. H follows L. M restrains the start of R, so M stopping R starts, which follows the completion of H. That's a big one. Follows the completion of H, but restrains M, so that means there's a connection there between M. R precedes G. E and R must both be finished before G starts, so E and R. E and R. Which we've got. A cannot start until both O and E are completed. O and E. And A and G finish together, and S cannot start until they're both completed. If I've missed one, I've done it on purpose. As you'll see in exercise 3, you have a different way that the information is presented to you. So with activity 3, so with activity 3, you don't have the written text. What you have is an activity list. You have, I believe, the duration, and then you have the dependency. This is a common format, how you would punch the information into Microsoft Project. You would write the activity name, you put the duration in, and you just put in the dependency numbers. So we're using, with the dependency numbers, which is matching up to the serial of that activity.
So when you read the line 1, activity 1, what's it got dependency next to it? Nothing. So that means that it's the first task. There's nothing else dependent on it. If you go to the next line, it will say that it's dependent on task 1. So that tells me that that can start after task 1. And you can also see the next line is also dependent on task 1. So that again shows me that it can start once that first task is completed. So it's just a different way of providing the information, probably a lot simpler, a lot cleaner than written text than what we've used before, but it's what we're going to use later as well. So how we plot this, you've got your precedence diagram here, and it's a template. Now the expectation is not to use every square, it's just a template. So the idea would be to start off with your first item probably on your left hand side. And by starting in the middle, it allows the diagram to branch out. You can go up and down. If you were to start up the top corner, you've got nowhere to go to come down and you get congested. So we start in the middle, we can work our way across. Now if you want to jump a line because it's cleaner, that's fine, okay? So the idea is to use this template to help plot your information. So like you've done with your network diagram, but we're using this chart. The most important thing though, gentlemen, with that is that we need to have these lines, these connection lines, these dependency lines that you draw on there, very clean and very clear. Because those lines are going to transfer more information. We're going to put numbers on those, and we need to be able to have them clear. So I did throw a ruler on there. Feel free to freehand it, but when you are drawing the connection lines, make sure you draw them nice and clean and not too close together, like I've drawn out here. If you do get to a tricky situation where all of a sudden you've got a box down here, so I'll put one over here, a box down here, and you need to get a connection across, what you can do is you can do a bridging line, which is like a loop, which really clearly shows that there's no connection. If I was to do a bridging loop and draw it straight across, it gets confusing, but by doing a loop, you can jump across lines. So that's just one way. If you get caught out, just do that, and it makes it very clean and easy to do that. So initially, again, have a go at drawing the precedence diagram, which is just a network diagram at this stage, with those dependency lines drawn in. Just to quickly identify as well, gentlemen, as well, when you're drawing your lines from your boxes, always have like going into this end and coming out. Don't have them coming out of the middle or the sides. So just always have a clean line coming in and a clean line coming out. So it sort of indicates that's the start and then that's the finish. We had B, C, D and E, which are all dependent on A, the first one, and then we just basically worked our way through. And the last four there, E, H, J and I, you can see that K was all dependent on those. It sort of brought in that last connection points for those dependency lines. So again, what we currently still have at the moment is still a network diagram, and then we're going to add further information onto this to enable us to start using this to calculate our critical path. So if you haven't got something as clean as this with your boxes, feel free to make your adjustments on yours. But what we're about to do now is add in the extra information. So what we can do, and you've got a little a legend on your sheet anyway, but what it asks us to do is initially put in the duration in the bottom right hand corner. So with task A, we put like duration of 1 day, B
I think was
2 days.
2 days. C,
3 days.
3. D was 4. E was 5. F 4. G was 3. H was 2. I 1. J 2. K 2. So what we could do for timeline, we could add up in the individual task days. So if we added all these days up, so we end up with 29 days. So if we were to do one task after another, after another, after another, it would take us 29 days. But we know that you don't do tasks like that. You just don't do one after another. You try and do concurrent tasks. If you do little bits and pieces with a work team, you're all doing other activities at the same time. So what we're saying is, what could be the minimum, the minimum time frame for us to complete this? And how we calculate that is we're looking at the longest pathway, but with the longest pathway. But we're making sure we're following the dependency lines.
A, C, F, G, J, K.
So pretty close to that, yeah. So what we would do now is we actually just we can just do a quick calculation to work that out. So with the numbers, what we do, 1. So 1 day has passed. So 1 day has passed on this line. So we've got 1 day coming in. So we've got 1 day coming in. So if I've got 1 day coming in, 2 days have now passed, I've got 3 days coming out. So I'm doing 2 lines. I've got 4 days coming out. I've got 5 days coming out. I've got 6 days coming out. So what I do now is I keep using that and I'm calculating as I go along. So, but at the moment, I've got a 4 and I've got a 3 coming in. Which one would I take? I have to take the highest number. I can't take the smaller number because the other task wouldn't be completed in time. So I take the bigger number. So I've got 2 numbers coming in. I take the 4. 4 and 4 is 8. 8 coming out. And I just keep working my way down. So I've got a 3 coming in. I've got 8. Okay, I've got 11 and 3, so I've got 12 coming out. I've got 11 coming in. I've got 13. I've got 8, I've got a 10 coming out. And I've got a 6. Biggest number there, 13 plus 2. So what I've determined that the completion time frame could be, if everything went to plan, 15 days. If I was to do one task after another, it would take 29. So 15 days. All the other tasks could be completed within that same time frame, and I'd get completed, and it would enable me to finish it within that 15 days. Does that make sense how I calculate it? Guys, do you want me to go through it again, or is that? So the key factor is take the number out, bring it in, add the numbers together. If I've got multiple numbers coming into it, I would take the biggest number out, add it on, and as you can see, I should add a 5 there. But the 8's bigger. So the critical path, it was Jeff, wasn't it?
Me.
Yeah. What did you say the critical path you thought it was?
A, C, F, G, J,
Okay. So pretty much spot on in that regard. So how we do that is we've calculated it, but what you've pretty much done, you follow that pathway. How we work out the critical path is we start here knowing that you work backwards. It has to be the last activity first, and then we follow the biggest numbers back. So we go 13, we go back, F, we're trying to get straight back to A, 4 is bigger, that's our critical path. That's the main task we should be focusing on. That's how we got to the 15. We follow that number. So if we focused on those tasks, that's our biggest durations. We should technically, if it goes to plan, we should be able to complete this project within 15 days. That's your critical path method. Now, if you were to input this data, so if you were to input the tasks, the duration and the dependency numbers, like exactly how we've presented on our table, if you were to enter that into Microsoft Project, it would automatically do this process behind the scenes, calculate it, and it can actually show you the critical path based on those algorithms, that calculation. Yeah, just start down there. Yeah. Just have a look at the next one. Yeah, start left to right. Yep. Exercise 4. I'll do the cascading number next anyway, but I don't reckon.
Oh, okay.
Cheat sheets I'll hand out. Yeah. So a lot of time, depending on the duration, organisations might put a percentage on, or after, if it's every 15 days, they might add a day. You know what I mean? So you've got that buffer. We know worst case scenario, 29 days. So it depends on what was quoted or what was tendered for. But it gives you an idea of, potentially behind the scenes of how things might be calculated. Because if it was calculated on critical path method, it's the minimum number without anything going wrong. There's no buffer in that in regards to leniency with that, unless you would have put contingencies in. So it's 15 days. June, July, I'm going to add 2 days for wet weather. So and allow that already pre-plan that part of that process. So if I was going to put this into a bar chart, at the moment with the bar chart, again, I could end up with a range of different bars there. How do I get this to cascade? And what I mean by cascade, we talked about it earlier, is follow one after another, is by putting it in the right cascading number sequence. Now, technically, you're halfway there because you've calculated the critical path. What we can do now is we can actually calculate how to replot this into a bar graph and get a cascading effect. And plot that out really visually on all these tasks in that cascade. So what we have to do now is we have to renumber our task sequence in a cascading number sequence. So how do we do that? This is where, if we go back to the original one, we've got a number following our critical path as closely as we can until we've numbered all our task activities. So obviously we start here at number 1, and I'm going to be following the line, trying to get straight to the next star, my critical path, and I'll make this task 2. Okay? I want to go to task, I want to make F3. Is there anything stopping F from being completed? B. Because I've already done this one, that's fine, but because there's a dependency line, I'll follow that back. B needs to be done, A is already numbered. So that becomes number 3. So I can't make that 3 because that task needs to be done. I jump straight back to the star, and I'll make that number 4. I can make G number 5 because there's nothing stopping G from being completed now. Okay, I can make J 6. There's nothing stopping that from happening. I want to make K 7, but there's a lot stopping K from being completed. So where I go back now, I take the next biggest number back. So I've come in on J. I want to make that 7. I can't because there's unfinished tasks. So I follow the next biggest number back, which is 12. I check. I want to make that 7. All the other connections coming out are already numbered. So I can make that 7. I want to make K 8. I can't. Follow the next biggest number back out, which is 10. I want to make H number 8. Anything stopping H. Not F. Come back. D and A. So make that 8. Then I can make that 9. I'll make that 10. I can't. Got one remaining. 10. Go back. And 11. So I've now put it in a cascading number sequence. So when I redraw that on a bar graph, it's going to have that nice cascading effect based on that critical path. It's just, as I said, I tried to follow that critical path. As soon as something stopped it, I had to go back and renumber it. And then I move forward. So what we're going to do now with that cascade number, so what we're going to end up with a new sequence. The cascading number sequence.
Yep.
So we're going to put on the left hand side in the can number 1 to 11, and then we're going to put the corresponding activity, which is a letter, massive space there, but we'll put that letter next to that new cascading number. The next box across, I believe we put in the duration, and then once we get to that point, I'll explain the next steps of colouring in the squares. But as you can sort of see, we've got that new cascading sequence calculated using that critical path method. What I would also like you guys to do, if I could, is also just in your activity list on that as well, just put a little star next to any critical path activity, just so we know what it is. On your list. Cool.
So we're going off that first.
First chart, yeah, first one. The critical path task first. So task A, so it's 1 day. We colour that in. And what we task obviously. The next task is task C, so we can jump down to that, which is 3 days. What we're going to do is make a nice solid line, colour that in, shade it in. Right. Now B is not a critical task, but F is. So what we do is we jump down a line till we get to F. We're actually skipping a whole line there. And F's 4 days. And then we colour that in. Now, eventually, you'll get to a point where you skip where we get to. Once we get to end of J, we're going to skip all the way down to K. nice solid line. So what we've created is your critical path by doing those lines. And what it should be able to tell us is, in line with the table, it should give us a total duration. If we've done it right, it should still finish on 15 days, which is great. Up there, 15. Cool. So now we've got those critical tasks in, we've got to go and fill in the non-critical tasks, and I call them floating tasks, okay? Because they're not critical, but they still need to be completed. So what we can do with the floating tasks, we still have to be mindful of their dependencies. So I know that task B still can't be completed until task 1's completed. So I can't start it on the same day. So it still has to be completed after that. So what I would do, I would draw an arrow. And the main difference is with the floating tasks is that it's 2 days. I'm just gonna, so it has to start after task 1, but what I can also do is put in some dashes here until I get to that line. What's that telling me? I call it a floating task.
That's the time you've got to do it.
The time I've got to do it, I can't start it any earlier because that's the arrow, has to start after, but it's telling me that I've got a day up my sleeve. I can slide that way. But if I was to slide that and bring it out here and cross my critical path, what happens to my whole timings? It gets blown out. As soon as something ruptures over that critical path, then my project's longer. So it shows you that anything that can be completed within this critical path, my floating tasks, will not affect my time frame. And you often see that on some of the programs where they've overlapped, and that shows you that they've been affected. So it does highlight where you had some movement for that one. When I come down to, I think the next one's I think that one's got a couple of dependencies. So what's I dependent on?
2 and 7.
2 and 7, which is B and G. So once G is completed, which is here, I can be done 1 day. So I can't start it any earlier. Then I've got D, which I don't think it's that's got a lot of I think H is dependent on D and F. Where's F? F is there. So if it's dependent on D and F, we have to do a line think E.
Yeah.
So at the moment, this one's called unleveled. We've basically just got the critical path in there, and we have the floating tasks. We can still see where the dependency lines fit in, when they have to be completed. But it also shows us our opportunities there for those floating tasks. We can actually move them around if we had to, start them on different days. They're not going to technically initially affect the 15-day time frame unless they cross over that critical path.